Hello. And welcome back to Film History MOOC Teaching Video 5. Let's enjoy some historical knowledge on film. In this Topics of Film History MOOC, we will look into the French Avant-Garde, sound and poetic realism. Prologue. Film production in Europe. France, Path versus Gaumont. During this period, the French film industry was still the largest, and its movies were the ones most frequently seen around the world. The two main firms, Path Frères and Gaumont, continued to expand, and other companies were formed in response to an increased demand from exhibitors. As in many Western countries, workers were winning a shorter work week and thus had more leisure time for inexpensive entertainments. The French firms also courted a wider middle-class audience. From 1905 to 1906, the French film industry grew rapidly. Path was already a large company, with 3 separate studios. It was also one of the earliest film companies to become vertically integrated. A vertically integrated firm is one controlling the production, distribution, and exhibition of a film. Vertical integration has been a major strategy pursued by film companies and often a measure of their strength. Path made its own cameras and projectors, produced films, and manufactured the film stock for release prints. In 1906, Path also began buying theaters. The following year, the firm began to distribute its own films by renting rather than selling them to exhibitors. By then, it was the largest film company in the world. Over the next few years, it started distributing films made by other companies as well. By 1905, Path employed 6 filmmakers, still overseen by Ferdinand Zecca, each making a film a week. The films encompassed a variety of genres: actualities, historical films, trick films, dramas, vaudeville acts, and chases. During 1903 and 1904, Path created an elaborate system for hand stenciling color onto release prints. Stencils were painstakingly cut from a copy of the film itself, with a different stencil for each color. Assembly lines of women workers then painted the colors frame by frame on each release print. Path reserved color for trick films and films displaying flowers or elegantly dressed women. Such hand coloring continued until the early sound era. Among Path's most profitable films were series starring popular comics, the Boyero series with André Dede, the Regaton films with the music hall star Prince, and, above all, the Max Linder series. Linder's films reflected the industry's growing bid for respectability by being set in a middle-class milieu. Max typically suffered embarrassment in social situations, such as wearing painfully tight shoes to an elegant dinner. He was often thwarted in love. In Un ruse de Marie, the husband's ruse, he unsuccessfully tries to commit suicide in various ways, calling upon his valet to fetch a knife, a gun, and so on. Linder's films were enormously influential. Charles Chaplin once referred to Linder as his professor and himself as Linder's disciple. Linder worked in both the United States and France from 1909 until his death in 1925. Aside from being a vertically integrated firm, Path also used the strategy of horizontal integration. This term means that a firm expands within one sector of the film industry, as when one production firm acquires and absorbs another one. Path enlarged its film production by opening studios in such places as Italy, Russia, and the United States. From 1909 to 1911, its Moscow branch made about half the films produced in Russia. Path's main French rival, Gaumont, also expanded rapidly. After finishing its new studio in 1905, the firm took on additional filmmakers. Alice Guy trained the story of a famous incident in French history. It was widely shown and had a successful release in the United States. The assassination of the Deux de Guise and similar works created a model of what art films should be like. The Film d'Art Company, however, lost money on most of its productions and was sold in 1911. On the whole, the French industry prospered. By 1910, the traveling fêtes foraines had dwindled, and large film theaters were the rule. During the same era, however, French firms were facing challenges in the lucrative American market and would soon lose their dominance over world markets. The cinema of France. During the early 1910s, the French film industry was still thriving. Many new theaters were being built, and demand was high. Although imported American films were beginning to encroach on the market, French production remained robust. In 1913, however, the largest company, Pathé Frères, took the first of several steps that ultimately would harm the French industry. It cut back on the increasingly costly production side of the business to concentrate on the profitable areas of distribution and exhibition. In the United States, French films were being squeezed out by the growth of independent firms. Pathé dropped its membership in the Motion Picture Patents Company, forming an independent distribution firm in 1913. This firm released several widely successful serials during the 1910s, including The Perils of Pauline, Introduction. By 1919, however, Pathé's concentration on serials and shorts put it on the margins of the American industry, which was dominated by big firms making features. Unlike Pathé, Gaumont expanded production in the years just before the war. Two important Gaumont directors, Léonce Perret and Louis Feuillade, did some of their best work during this period. Perret had come to fame in 1909 as a comic actor, directing his own series of Huon's films. During the mid-1910s, he also made some major features. L'Enfant de Paris, Child of Paris, 1913, and Roman d'Unmou's Tale of a Cabin Boy, 1914 were intensely melodramatic narratives of abducted children. They were notable for their beautiful cinematography, including skillful location filming and an unusual use of backlighting. Perret also varied his camera angles considerably and broke scenes down into more shots than was then typical. He thus helped expand the cinema's expressive possibilities. Perret's style became more formulaic later on, when he worked in Hollywood in the second half of the decade and returned to France to make historical epics in the 1920s. Feuillade continued to work in a variety of genres, including comedies, and a naturalistic series, La vie telle qu'elle est, Life as It Is. His main achievements, however, were in the new serial format. Despite Pathé's and Gaumont's dominance of French production, they made no attempt to monopolize the industry, and smaller companies coexisted peacefully with them, staying in business by specializing in certain types of films. All this activity came to an abrupt halt when World War I began. By the end of 1914, it had become apparent that the fighting would continue for quite a while, and some theaters reopened. In early 1915, production resumed on a limited basis. Newsreels became more important, and all the firms made highly patriotic fiction films, such as Mères Françaises French Mothers, 1917, René Hervel and Louis Mercanton. Pathé's response to the war was to focus its efforts on its American distribution wing, releasing films made by independent producers in the United States. With the huge success of The Perils of Pauline and subsequent serials, Path remained profitable. It was, however, no longer providing a stable leadership for French film production. Through its distribution, Path was also helping American films gain a greater share of the French market. French intellectuals and the general public alike adored the new American stars they discovered during the war: Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, William S. Hart, and Lillian Gish. Writer Philippe Soupault suggests how suddenly and intensely American films affected Parisian viewers. Then one day we saw hanging on the walls great posters as long as serpents. At every street corner a man, his face covered with a red handkerchief, leveled a revolver at the peaceful passers-by. We imagined that we heard galloping hoofs, the roar of motors, explosions, and cries of death. We rushed into the cinema, and realized immediately that everything had changed. On the screen appeared the smile of Pearl White, that almost ferocious smile which announced the revolution, the beginning of a new world. Serial queen Pearl White was idolized in France after the release of Les Mystères de New York, the French title of her second Path serial, The Exploits of Elaine 1915. During 1917, American films passed the 50% mark in French exhibition. The real effect of American films in France was not apparent until after the war. From 1918 to 1919, French firms attempting to bring production back up to its old levels found it virtually impossible to reduce the American share of their market. France in the 1920s. The French film industry after World War I. French film production declined during World War I, as many resources were drained away to support the fighting. Moreover, American films increasingly entered France. In the years immediately following the war's end, only 20 to 30% of films screened there were French, with Hollywood supplying most of the rest. French producers faced an uphill struggle in trying to regain their pre-war strength. Throughout the late silent era, industry experts believed that French production was in a crisis. In 1929, for instance, France made 68 features, while Germany produced 220 and the United States 562. Even in 1926, the worst pre-Depression year for European production, Germany had managed 202 films to France's 55, while Hollywood outstripped both with about 725. In 1928, one of the best years for the Europeans, France made 94 films, compared to 221 for Germany and 641 for the United States. As such figures suggest, France's crisis fluctuated in its severity, but the struggle to boost production gained little ground in the post-war decade. Competition from import. What created the problems confronting French film production between 1918 and 1928? For one thing, imported films continued to pour into France in the 1920s. American films were the most numerous, especially early in the decade. Even though America's share declined steadily throughout the mid to late 1920s, other countries, primarily Germany and Great Britain, gained ground faster than did France. The situation for exports was little better. The domestic French market itself was relatively small, and films seldom could recover their costs without going abroad. Foreign films, however, were difficult to place in the lucrative American market, and only a tiny number of French films had any success there during this period. With American films dominating most other markets, the French could count on only limited export primarily to areas that already had cultural exchange with France, such as Belgium, Switzerland, and French colonies in Africa and Southeast Asia. Thus there was a continuous call for a distinctively French cinema that might help counter foreign competition, both at home and abroad. Companies were apparently willing to experiment, and several directors central to the fledgling French Impressionist movement, Abel Gance, Marcel L'Herbier, Germain Dulac, and Jean Epstein, made their early films for large firms. Disunity within the film industry. French production was also hampered by disunity. Before World War I, two big companies, Pathé and Gaumont, controlled the French film industry. After the war, both cut back severely on production, the riskiest sector of the industry, and concentrated instead on surer profits from distribution and exhibition. Thus the largest French firms backed off from vertical integration, just as vertically integrated firms were strengthening the Hollywood industry. France's production sector consisted of a few large and medium-sized firms and of many small companies. The latter often made only one or a few films each and then disappeared. This artisanal production strategy offered little hope for successful competition with America. Hi. We hope you have enjoyed this topic too so far. This teaching video will continue on to the second part. Thank you and see you all there.